Something about this story does not quite make sense. In the summer of 1665, the city of London descended into a silence that no living person who witnessed it ever truly forgot. The streets emptied, the bells rang without ceasing, and beneath the soil of one of the most populated cities in the world, thousands of bodies were lowered into pits so vast that eyewitnesses compared them to craters torn from the earth itself. This was the Great Plague of London, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague to strike England. Officially, it is a story of tragedy, of civic response, of a city overwhelmed. But when you begin to examine the records that survived, the burial registers, the pamphlets, the letters of parish clerks written by candlelight, you start to notice something the history books rarely mention. The official numbers do not add up. The timelines do not quite align. And buried somewhere beneath the accepted account lies a question that has quietly troubled historians for centuries. In the desperate rush to clear the streets of the dying, how many of those who entered the pits were not yet truly dead? To understand what happened in 1665, you must first understand what London looked like in the years before the plague arrived. The city was, by the standards of its age, enormous. Estimates place its population at roughly 460,000 people, packed into a labyrinth of medieval streets that had been built for a fraction of that number. There was no sewage system in the modern sense. The River Thames, which supplied much of the city's water, also received its waste. The parish of St. Giles in the Fields, which sits today near the British Museum, was among the most densely inhabited and most squalid areas in all of England. It was there in the spring of 1665 that the first deaths were recorded. By June, the bills of mortality, the weekly death tallies compiled by parish clerks and printed for public distribution, began to list deaths under the heading plague with alarming regularity. By July, the numbers had become extraordinary. By August, the city was losing more than 6,000 people per week. King Charles II and his court had long since departed for Oxford. The wealthy had fled to the countryside. What remained were the poor, the sick, the people who had nowhere else to go, and the officials charged with managing a catastrophe for which there was no precedent in living memory. The man responsible for overseeing much of the official response was Sir John Lawrence, the Lord Mayor of London. His orders, issued throughout the summer and autumn of 1665, form one of the primary documentary records of how the city tried to contain the spread of disease. Among those orders were instructions governing the plague pits. The plague pits, or common graves, as the official records sometimes called them, were not an invention of 1665. London had used mass burial grounds during earlier outbreaks, but the pits dug in this year were unlike anything that had come before in their sheer scale. The largest of them at Aldgate was documented by the writer Daniel Defoe in his famous account, A Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1722, more than half a century after the events he described. Defoe wrote of a pit 40 feet in length, 16 feet wide, and, in the end, more than 20 feet deep. Into this single excavation, more than 1,100 bodies were eventually placed. The official explanation for the pits is straightforward. With the graveyards of individual parishes overwhelmed, some churchyards reportedly receiving more than 200 bodies in a single night, the city had no choice but to open communal burial grounds. The dead needed to be interred quickly. Decomposing bodies in the summer heat were understood even then to be a source of further contagion. Speed was essential. The pits were a practical solution to an extraordinary problem. But Defoe, drawing on the accounts of survivors, recorded something else. He wrote of bodies brought to the pits at night, by lantern light, and of the carters who collected the dead from the streets and houses, sometimes moving with such haste that they did not always stop to confirm that the person they were collecting had, in fact, died. He described hearing, or claiming to have heard from those who were there, the sound of voices rising from the carts. He was careful, in the way of an educated man of his era, not to make direct accusations. He framed these details as rumors, as things reported by others, but he included them nonetheless. The primary source for understanding the administrative response to the 1665 plague is a document known as the Orders Conceived and Published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London, issued in June of that year. When you read through it closely, certain passages are striking for what they reveal about the fears of the time. The orders specified that any household in which plague was found was to be locked shut, not merely recommended for quarantine, but physically locked, with a watchman posted outside, for a period of at least 40 days after the last death within. The person who reported the presence of plague in a house was to be rewarded. The family inside was to be given no warning before the door was sealed. Provisions would be delivered, but the occupants could not leave. Those who broke quarantine faced imprisonment. In a letter preserved in the state papers at the National Archives, a London physician named Nathaniel Hodges, one of the few doctors who remained in the city throughout the outbreak, described the panic that these orders created among the poor. He wrote of people concealing the sick, hiding bodies beneath floorboards, smuggling the dying out of houses at night before the examiner of health could arrive and condemn the household to weeks of lockup. If the dead were being hidden, then the official death toll was already incomplete. And if families were concealing illness for fear of being locked inside, then the examiners, often elderly women described in the orders as ancient matrons with no medical training, were making their assessments under conditions of deliberate concealment and extreme social pressure. The bills of mortality listed 68,596 deaths from plague in London in 1665. Most historians now believe the true figure was considerably higher, perhaps 100,000 or more. The acknowledged gap in the records is not disputed. What is less often discussed is why the gap is so large and what it suggests about the reliability of the systems that were in place. Here is where the record becomes genuinely strange. In several London parishes, burial register entries from the autumn of 1665 include a notation that appears in no other period. The phrase, visited, placed beside a name, indicating death by plague, with no additional detail about the circumstances. This was standard, but in at least 3 registers, those of St. Olav Hart Street, St. Bride Fleet Street, and the parish of St. Botolph Aldgate, researchers have noted a small number of entries where the same individual's name appears twice, separated by a period of days or weeks. The standard interpretation is a clerical error, a name recorded in anticipation of death, and then recorded again at actual death. But the timing in some of these entries is unusual. In the register of St. Botolph Aldgate, there are entries from September of 1665, in which a name recorded as deceased on one date reappears, with a different notation, approximately 10 to 14 days later. The gap corresponds almost precisely to the period that the plague's secondary symptoms, the hemorrhagic complications, were known to produce states of extreme collapse in the patient, states that contemporary physicians described using language that today reads uncomfortably close to descriptions of apparent death. Nathaniel Hodges himself, in his medical treatise Loimologia, published in 1672, noted that plague victims sometimes fell into a stupor so deep as to resemble in every outward aspect the condition of the deceased. No one is claiming these individuals were buried alive in the pits. The register entries may have perfectly innocent explanations, but the pattern is there, quiet and unacknowledged, in the archives. There is a pamphlet, printed in London in 1666 and preserved in the collection of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, whose title alone gives pause. It is called A Warning to the Living, concerning the hasty disposal of the visitated, and it was written by a man who identified himself only as a surgeon lately returned from the parish of Stepney. In it, the anonymous author described witnessing, on at least 2 occasions, bodies loaded onto the dead carts that showed what he called the motion of the extremities, movement in the hands or feet. He wrote that when he raised this concern with the cart operator, he was told that such movements were common in the newly dead and that there was no time for deliberation. The cart moved on. The pamphlet was not widely circulated. It does not appear in the standard bibliographies of plague literature. It was rediscovered in the 1970s by a historian named Paul Slack, who included a brief reference to it in his comprehensive work on plague in early modern England. Slack treated it with appropriate scholarly caution, noting that such pamphlets were common in the period and that their claims could not be verified. He did not dismiss it. He simply moved on. There are also the parish minutes of St. Margaret's, Westminster, which include a record from October 1665 of a payment made to a watchman for what is described as the extraordinary duty of attending to a removed person. The context of the entry, placed between payments for coffin timber and lime, strongly suggests that the removed person was someone connected to the plague burials. The nature of the extraordinary duty is not explained. It is one of those archival fragments that sits in the margin of history, too small to be definitive, too specific to be entirely accidental. Let us hold these pieces together for a moment and look at what they form. You have a city in which the mechanisms for identifying death were, by any modern standard, profoundly inadequate. The examiners who certified plague deaths were untrained women working in conditions of fear, darkness, and social pressure. You have official orders that incentivize speed and penalize concealment, creating a system in which the motivations of everyone involved pointed toward moving the dead, or those believed to be dead, out of sight as quickly as possible. You have a physician who documented states of apparent death in plague victims. You have a pamphlet describing witnessed movement in bodies placed on death carts. You have burial register anomalies that have never been fully explained, and you have an acknowledged gap of perhaps 30,000 people between the official death count and the estimated actual death count. 30,000 individuals whose fates are simply unaccounted for in the records. None of this proves anything. The history of epidemics is full of administrative chaos, of records imperfectly kept, of horrors that occurred not from malice, but from the collapse of the ordinary systems by which human societies function. The buried pamphlet may have been exaggeration. The register anomalies may be nothing more than clerical errors. The payment to the watchman may refer to something entirely different from what it seems to suggest. But what the records do establish, beyond any serious doubt, is that the London of 1665 was a city that had organized itself under the pressure of catastrophe in ways that made it structurally very difficult to catch a mistake of this kind. The incentives were all pointing in the same direction, and the pits were very deep. The last plague pit to be officially opened in London in 1665 was at Moorfields, north of the old city wall. In 2015, during excavation work for the Crossrail project, the underground railway line that now runs beneath the city, workers discovered more than 3,000 skeletons at Charterhouse Square, a site identified as a plague burial ground. Forensic analysis confirmed that many of the individuals had died from Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The bones were carefully documented and studied. The findings were significant. They told us a great deal about the demographics of those who died, about their health and nutrition in life, about the physical reality of mass burial in the 17th century. What the bones cannot tell us is anything about the moments that preceded burial. They cannot tell us what the examiner said when she looked at the body. They cannot tell us how long the body had been lying in the street before the cart arrived. They cannot tell us whether the hands moved. Maybe there was nothing more to this story than what the official records describe. A city overwhelmed, doing its imperfect best. Maybe the pamphlet was sensational, the register entries were clerical, and the watchman's payment was for something mundane. Maybe the gap in the death count reflects only the difficulty of record keeping during an epidemic, nothing more. Or perhaps, in the pits beneath the streets of London, there are answers to questions that no one has ever quite known how to ask. Questions that were buried not out of conspiracy, but out of the oldest human instinct there is. The need, in a moment of unbearable crisis, to simply keep moving, to not look too closely, to let the cart roll on into the dark. The city above those pits has been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing of 1665 remains visible at street level. But the ground below has not changed, and sometimes, in the silence of an archive, in the margins of a faded register, in the brief, careful sentences of a forgotten surgeon who only wanted someone to pay attention, something persists, something that has not, perhaps, been fully heard.